Welcome to this edition of our Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Today, we're going to discuss a question from the Objector Compass Point, and that question is, tell a story of a time where you chose to be actively curious. What were the conditions that led you to embrace curiosity?
All right, so I'm going to say, whenever you don't know what to do, be curious. And so my story is January of 2021. I had just retired, and I was curious whether I actually had anything to offer education anymore. So out of that curiosity, which I'd say the conditions for that curiosity were plenty of space and plenty of time to think and reflect. And out of that emerged, over many iterations, the idea of the Human School. So whenever you don't know what to do, be curious. There you go. That's my story.
I love it. I'll share that as a kind of a guiding principle, I oftentimes find myself in my day job, for lack of a better word, embedded in groups of people who I have some relationships with, but not a ton of formal knowledge of. And I find that I have to be I hope that I'm being a very good listener. I think the difference between being curious and being, and listening to a conversation, though, is listening without judgment. And so one of the things I think I've had to do a better job of is when you enter into someone else's space and you're trying to pick up the signals and the cues and the language that people use and the body language that they exhibit, it can be really quick to form judgments about people by their facial expressions or the tone of their voice. And what I've tried to become better at is listening without judgment. And to me, that's a form of curiosity that I've had to grow into. And so, like Randy's point, it'd be easy for me to want to interject myself into those conversations, but I remind myself that I'm a guest in that space. It doesn't mean that I don't at some point offer feedback or offer a question, oftentimes a form of curiosity in and of itself. But as a kind of a self skill, I think that listening without judgment is a form of curiosity.
Love that.
With teaching, I found pretty quickly that was the best way to develop relationships with students, and especially the students where things seemed really hard. I think that we all have those moments where someone pushes our buttons and we get really mad and we get really frustrated, and then we just assume that they're a jerk or they're this or they're that. And I found with students, if I could be curious, that oftentimes I got a lot more really worthwhile information. So I remember, my first year of teaching, I had a 9th grade student who, had like a little bit of an attitude on a regular basis, but it was just kind of part of her personality. But the one day I remember we were talking about something and she responded in a way that was so outside of her character. And I thought, okay. So I could have doubled down. I could have gotten mad. I could have kicked her out and sent her to the office, written her up, whatever. So instead, I got everybody started and I brought her to the hallway. I said, what's going on? That's not typically you, what's happening. And she said that today was the anniversary of her mother's death and that she was just having a really hard time with it. And then she started to cry. I was like, okay. So we talked about it for a little while, but I try to remind myself of that when I'm dealing with something that I don't understand or that doesn't fit. And I watched it again today. I was in truancy court, and a student has missed something like 88 days of the school year. And the judge, again, has this opportunity to just nail the kid and the parent, find them, call it a day. And the student had a not great interaction with the principal the week before, had done something that was pretty out of character. And so the principal did kind of what I did, where she said to the judge, here was this altercation. Something is wrong. This isn't normal. And so the judge tried to ask the student. They didn't really give information. And then the judge decided, having not even known this child, but just was curious, she was like, we're going to talk in my chambers. We're going to come back. And was able through that conversation to get some really important information about what was happening for this child that completely changed how she responded to that. And so I think being curious and, I mean, in part, believing the best in the people that you're interacting with, I think can completely change the trajectory of what we're doing, and how we react to something. Because I think, unfortunately, we get stuck in these systems of if this, then that, if this, then that, and we don't stop to ask why or what if or what's happening. And that asking that question reveals an entire other trajectory and another layer to it. So that's the thing that I keep coming back to when we're talking about this.
So the second part of the question was about the conditions that help to create curiosity. And I'm wondering if we could play with that idea. I wonder, Randy, you had talked about how part of what allowed you to be curious was maybe time and space. And then Rachel, you described a time where there was no time and no space. It was immediate. And so you've got these two interesting stories, which kind of juxtapose this idea that, like, if I just have enough time, but in one of these situations, it was the default. And so I'm just wondering if we have other thoughts about what other conditions allow us to be curious or allow others to be curious.
What you're asking reminds me of the Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow book. I'm not sure if that's the exact title, but
Daniel
the Daniel
Kahneman,
Kahneman, and the idea that one's the sort of intuition and the other is the more methodical, curious, questioning kind too. And, do we need both? And do we need to hone both too? Do we need to be more aware of those moments of intuition when we need to be naturally curious? Do we sort of like build that muscle a little bit?
Yeah.
And do we also have to build the muscle that when we're going down the rabbit hole, that we become, that we sort of build that habit to become more curious initially? And I make the connection to your concept of judgment. And I think I've written about this recently. I can't remember the exact resource, so I don't want to not credit somebody, but I'll credit whoever it was that raised this and put it to the surface. But that we oftentimes judge people based on what our own beliefs are and what our own paradigm that we're in. And we want to sort of accuse them or dehumanize them for not believing the same thing. But they're human beings.
Yep.
And nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be a crappy human being. At least we should assume that.
Yeah.
We should always go with good intentions. And so the idea of building that muscle to say, like, I need to be curious about why is that person thinking that? What thoughts, what ways of thinking have they not acquired yet? And how can I create the conditions to help them see that there's another way to approach this?
I also think about that through the lens of a continuum. Like we've talked about our mind shifts as even though there are somewhat polarized ends of the spectrum in a sense, we are all on different contexts along that continuum, right? And so where we see ourselves at any given moment in our thinking and where someone who is at a different place, it doesn't respect the fact that in a different context, they might be the complete opposite of even us, where we think we are justified there as well. And so just to kind of layer onto that conversation about that, it's recognizing that we all are on a continuum, and it is always contextual.
And I want to layer on and add an extra element to that too. And I'm not saying that I'm right and they're wrong, and therefore I'm going to help them be right. I'm not saying that. I believe, based on my beliefs, that there may be another way to see this, for that person to see this, but I'm also open to hearing and listening to what they have to say, and I might therefore change my own thinking. So it's a two-way street, and I just wanted to make clear that I'm not saying like everything that I believe is what everybody else should believe. But if I feel like there's another way, then how do I help them see that there's another way to think about this? And how do I listen and potentially learn a new way or a deeper way to think about something?
And I think that just to kind of keep that conversation going, and I'd love, Rachel, for your thoughts on this. What you're talking about, Randy, is being even curious about your own beliefs and practices consistently. And, this believing that there is only one way, or that there's not nuance, or that there's only black and there's only white, and how we can not only be curious about others, but curious about our own beliefs and our own perspectives and what that might look like. So again, Rachel, feel free to jump into either of those conversations.
Thanks. I really liked the point that you made, Randy, about the two versions of it. And I was thinking about how I think the one that's automatic is, to me, rooted in empathy. It's being genuinely curious about whether or not other people are okay. And I think that as a teacher, it's an incredibly important muscle to have. But then I also think that to cultivate that in everybody, that our assumptions aren't the worst. That when, someone cuts you off in traffic, or, they are rude to you in the store, or whatever that happens, I'm not suggesting that we create an entire sad narrative about maybe they're running to an emergency or something, but just taking a moment to wonder, are you okay? And that was one of the things that I kept thinking today in the first couple of truancy conversations, and even in a couple of disciplinary conversations, is I felt like I wished that question was asked more often. Are you okay? And just asking that, I think, creates space and conditions for people to be able to share what's happening for them. And then I also think that allows us to practice the automaticity of the curiosity for that version of it. But I appreciate your point too about a methodical nature of it as well, when there's space, when we're planning conversations in professional development, or we're planning lessons, or we're even reading something, trying to be intentional about where we can ask questions and genuinely just be there to listen, as opposed to like ask questions in order to answer, which is,
One of the things I think is really interesting about our conversation, and, we've committed to learning in public, and none of these conversations, other than the question, is really pre-planned. I think that when people think about curiosity, they would probably see it through the lens of learning about things. And our entire conversation has been about people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that a big part of our work is because we want to be human centered, and we want to be focused on mind shifts in people. But I would note that I wonder, here's me being curious, when people think about curiosity, do they see it through a lens of being curious about people and in building relationships, or do they typically traditionally see it through the lens of being curious about stuff or learning things, which is not inherently bad. It just doesn't frame our conversations. So as we wrap up, I'm wondering if there's any thoughts you have on that.
It's interesting that you say that, because as I was listening to both of you, I kept thinking, like, how do we bring this back to the language that we use? And I think that when you are curious, when you demonstrate curiosity, you help others be seen, heard, and valued, if we're using our language. And so is the stuff, the non-human stuff, is that sort of the content of the relationship?
Well,
I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And it's aligned to the objector mindset, because the mind shift is really rooted in how do we move from being passively compliant to actively curious. And I think that assumption is oftentimes, to your point, Randy, about the stuff, the human part is we can figure the stuff part out. What we really need is to engage with one another's, as Rachel says, through empathy. We can design beginning with empathy, and the human, we design with the human first. So again, I think it speaks a lot to the framework, the structure, whatever you want to call it, of our thinking around the human school, because the first place we should be curious is probably about one another
Mm-hmm.
in an authentic way,
Mm-hmm.
in a non-judgmental way.
And I also think it's the first step that, I mean, it is literally our first mind shift, but I think it's that for a purpose, that everything else flows from that curiosity, that every other navigation that we have requires us to start with curiosity, whether it's about ourselves, whether it's other people, our contexts, that if we aren't starting by being curious, then nothing else is going to shift because we're not asking questions. We're just sitting within our own predetermined belief.
I love that. Well, I thank you both for a great conversation. And for those of you out there who are watching or listening, make sure you visit thehuman.school and the Learning in Public Hub for other conversations like this. You can also join our Facebook community. And just remember that here at the Human School, we are committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.